B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, October 1st, 2020. An increasingly desperate Donald Trump continues to promote white nationalism, racism, and xenophobia. And it's making some of his cult followers, the lawmakers of the Republican Party, really nervous because their loyalty to Trump may cost them big time just a little over a month from now when Americans go to the polls. So last night at a mob rally in Minnesota, Trump went after Ilhan Omar again, unleashing a xenophobic attack that clearly was well received by his almost all-white audience there with their MAGA hats and their willful ignorance. And so Trump questioned her standing as an American during a rant about a video that's been posted by a right-wing group allied with him that researchers say is part of a coordinated disinformation campaign. That video accuses Omar's campaign of ballot harvesting, but provides no verifiable evidence that her campaign collected ballots illegally or was involved in voter fraud. And as Trump rattled off his grievances against Omar, who, as you know, emigrated from Somalia to the United States when she was 12. She's been an American citizen for more than 20 years, but she comes from one of those shithole countries that Trump loves to bash, and it's a proven winner applause line for his mob rally audiences. So they started chanting, "Lock her up." As Trump said, harvesting is terrible, but it's the least of things that she has done. Then she tells us how to run our country. Can you believe it? How the hell did Minnesota elect her? What the hell is wrong with you people, right? What the hell happened? And another massive issue for Minnesota is the election of Joe Biden's plan to inundate your state with a historic flood of refugees. 700% increase, refugees coming from the most dangerous places in the world, including Yemen, Syria, and your favorite country, Somalia, right? As Trump drew a chorus of boos. So this kind of division is his game plan. And he refuses to try to soften his bombast, his bullying. He believes he did a great job in the debate on Tuesday night. And his White House staff is afraid to tell him otherwise. And he will, according to the polls, not lose any votes from his base, from his clearly racist appeals. We'll get to the white supremacist groups and the Proud Boys in a moment. But I love to see Republicans squirming about this. Mitch McConnell first declined to issue his own statement. He said, we've got this African-American Republican Senator, Tim Scott, what he said. But McConnell was pressed, and he called Trump's commentary in the debate unacceptable, not to in his refusal to respond to Chris Wallace's demand that he repudiate white supremacists. McConnell said it's unacceptable not to condemn white supremacists, but he didn't mention Trump by name. Lindsey Graham, who is tied with his opponent, Jamie Harrison, for the Senate seat from South Carolina, Lindsey said the president should make it clear Proud Boys is a racist organization antithetical to American ideals. This shows that they are very worried that Trump may take the whole Republican Party down with him. And don't believe for a minute that they won't rise back almost immediately. but it is a plausible scenario. It's leading people like Tim Scott, who said, well, perhaps Trump misspoke, but if he doesn't correct it, I guess he didn't misspeak. Now that shows the level of fear that Trump has instilled in the leading members of his own political party. And it is the second time in 2 weeks. As you know, they had to repudiate, again, meekly, his statements about how he might not leave office if he loses the election. But aside from that, he has most of the members of his Republican Party by the balls. They have given up any separation from him, any independence. And I hope that voters will make them pay. Not entirely confident about that, but the elements are there, and I hope that people will react in that way. So, as the Commission on Presidential Debates, which is a corporate-controlled entity and a monster of its own, they have hinted that they're going to be making changes, including maybe giving a microphone switch to the debate moderator to cut Trump off when he tries to interrupt Biden. And Trump, who spent yesterday, along with his allies, attacking Chris Wallace, working the ref, for Trump's own excruciatingly bad behavior in the presentation on Tuesday night. Well, now he's saying that the commission is moving the goalposts. And he said that he had been the dominant force in the debate. Well, yeah. According to the New York Times, Mr. Trump himself was not displeased with his own performance. On the contrary, he was elated about the debate and saw it as a successful outing for him, according to 3 people close to the campaign. Some of Trump's advisors who shy away from giving him bad news made no attempt to disabuse the president of his self-deception. And advisors had tried to prepare Trump for a question about white supremacy, but it didn't really work out so well, did it? Over at Mint-Press News, Raul Diego picks up on a document from the Department of Homeland Security and Preparedness in the state of New Jersey. Last week, that outlet published a supplemental threat assessment on the upcoming election called The Convergence of COVID-19 Nationwide Civil Unrest and the Upcoming Election. The 13-page report identifies the pandemic as the driving factor behind public health fears, economic instability, political dissent, and cultural turmoil. It's the first publicly released evaluation of concerns that law enforcement officials appear to have about the post-election period. In August, the FBI distributed a bulletin to police departments across the country, warning about domestic extremists across the ideological spectrum who are likely to continue to plot against government and election-related targets to express their divisive grievances involving government policies and actions. The Bureau's missive directed police to prepare to act prior to a possible Democratic presidential administration due to fears that stricter firearm regulations would be enacted quickly thereafter. Now, you can hear the political threads in those comments. And they are dancing, in ways to try to avoid Trump's Twitter targeting. But it's clear that federal authorities are concerned. And while they mention the anarchist and anti-government racially motivated mobs of disaffected Americans, they add on either side of the political spectrum. And they're aware, like everybody is, that With so many Americans voting by mail, the results will not be known on election night, maybe even for 2 or 3 weeks. And during that time, as Trump gets more and more desperate, it's believed that he will try to shut down the vote counting as long as he is ahead. And if he's behind, he's likely to declare that it's all rigged and that he should just be allowed to get 4 more years, and then he'll say he wants to rule by decree, I suppose. And in the Mint Press story, Raul Diego reminds us of the guy on the streets of Minneapolis right after the killing of George Floyd, the so-called umbrella man who was breaking windows. He had this unusual gas mask headgear on. And he's been identified as a 32-year-old unnamed suspect who is a member of the Aryan Cowboys, a prison gang out of Minnesota and Kentucky. And when you put that together with Proud Boys, with Boogaloo Boys, with the Three Percenters, Trump does appear to be organizing armed right-wing white supremacists to go to the streets and try to propel him into a second term at all costs. And over at The Intercept today, Darrell Johnson, that's not a name you're going to likely remember, but back in 2009, he was muzzled by the Obama administration and hustled out of the Department of Homeland Security after he wrote a report warning about the rise of these armed white extremist groups. And in an article he co-wrote with Eric Lichtblau, they ask about the FBI's failure to publicly identify the motives of Stephen Paddock. He was the guy who took, dozens of weapons into a high-floor suite at the Mandalay Bay and opened fire, killing 58 people at a country music festival. That was just about 3 years ago in Las Vegas. And to this day, the FBI has said, well, they can't really figure out what his motive was. But these co-authors note that Paddock appeared fixated on right-wing extremism, including anti-government conspiracy theories, threats to the Second Amendment rights, and overly burdensome taxes. One witness told Vegas police that Paddock was kind of fanatical about his anti-government views and that he believed someone had to wake up the American public and get them to arm themselves in response to looming threats. And while Christopher Wray, the FBI director, has belatedly acknowledged that the Bureau considered the rising threat of violent domestic extremists to be on par with foreign and Islamic-inspired terrorist groups, they play this false equivalency game. And Trump was at it in the debate on Tuesday. He just said he doesn't see much coming from the right. He just demonized left-wingers, including Antifa, which he uses to mischaracterize the entire police reform movement and the largely peaceful protests that erupted in cities all across the country after the egregious killing of George Floyd. And the authors toward the end here say, both of us have examined from a close vantage point the rise of right-wing extremism. Darrell Johnson was the author of a 2009 report at Homeland Security on the rising threat, which was retracted under political pressure by Republicans. Well, it was the Obama administration that succumbed to that pressure. And Lichtblau, of course, a former New York Times reporter, has written about the subject extensively over the years. And NBC got a hold of some documents from Homeland Security. These are talking points that were generated and distributed after the incidents in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And the alleged shooter, the young white boy Kyle Rittenhouse, was characterized in these talking points in a sympathetic manner. They said that he took his rifle to Kenosha, the scene of the rioting, to help defend small business owners. And so once again, they try to spin things. And this is an official government agency that is trying to spin up or soften the image of this young guy with what was either an assault weapon or something close to it, who had no right to have that firearm, and as an underage person had no right to be packing heat on the streets of Kenosha. So here's a comment from Elizabeth Newman, who served as the Assistant Secretary in the Trump administration at DHS. What strikes me about the talking points is they didn't call for calm among the public. Even in the early hours after the incident, it was known private militias had self-deployed. They seemed more interested in Rittenhouse's reputation than calling for calm and actual law and order. And Newman left the Trump administration this past April. She is now supporting Biden for president. Another set of talking points out of DHS said the media were incorrectly labeling Patriot Prayer in Portland as racists after clashes erupted between the group and protesters there. So we have a government agency under Republican control doing PR, crisis PR, for right-wing extremists. And these are the groups that Trump claims he has always denounced, but he dog whistles at them, tells them to stand by. And it's disgusting. I think that's the best way I can sum it up. George Will, who is the kind of senior elder conservative pundit pre-Trump days, he trotted out some of his big vocabulary to suggest that the rest of the presidential debates should be canceled. Want to hear some of his big words? The putrescence of America's public life was pitilessly displayed Tuesday when, for 98 minutes, whatever remains of the nation's domestic confidence and international stature shriveled like a brittle autumn leaf. The national interest demands that the other two scheduled mortifications, fraudulently advertised as presidential debates, should be canceled. When a nation makes itself pathetic, the response of enemy nations is not sympathy. And an additional 180 or so minutes of ignorant assertions, mitigated only by the inarticulateness of the purveyors of them, will swell the electorate's already abundant crop of cynics, well defined as people prematurely disappointed about the future. Okay. It's not going to happen. Trump needs the narcissism feeding. Trump believes that by dominating in a brutal rhetorical way these settings that he shows what a big man he is. But he's really just being a little dick. And Biden can't walk away from these commitments because he'll be called a loser and a guy who can't stand up to Trump, who withered under his, behavior in the first debate. So you don't have to watch him. I probably will. I didn't know about this. The New York Times today is reporting that Matt Drudge has had a change of heart, or at least a change of mind. I'm not sure he has a heart. But the Drudge Report, which was a big booster of Trump in 2016, has now been declared just one more purveyor of fake news, according to Trump. Because after the presidential debate, he wrote, "Chaos reigns in hell debate. Undecided voters describe president as a crackhead, arrogant in focus group. Joe faces down raging Don." And this report indicates the cracks started to appear last summer, 2019, when Drudge Report featured a headline about the slow progress on a new barrier on the southern border. "No new wall at all caps, he wrote. In December, when the House impeached the president, The site went big once again, Trump on brink. And the other allies of the president, like Dan Bongino, he says, Drudge has abandoned you. I never will. Yeah, that kind of loyalty. That's richly deserved, isn't it? In the Washington Times, the Mooney Looney paper says, the Drudge Report has stoked alarm on the right for appearing to pivot on its support for President Trump, with increasingly linking to stories that are critical of the administration and to media websites accused of having an anti-Trump bias. Well, I didn't know that because I haven't looked at the Drudge Report in 15 years. Also in the debate on Tuesday, Trump said that bad things happen in Philadelphia, and everybody knows that. And at The Intercept today, Akela Lacey talks about Trump ordering his minions to carefully watch voting sites. And Philadelphia was on his mind because on Tuesday, Trump supporters who called themselves poll watchers were booted out of early voting sites. And the election officials in Philly say, well, there's a good reason for this. No poll watchers of any stripe are permitted in these satellite election offices because they are not distinctly polling places. Now, of course, Trump and his supporters don't care about the fine points of law and election practices. So they're trying to make a lot of noise about this, make it seem like they are being singled out for rejection. And that victimization, of course, is symptomatic of the entire Trump virus. He railed on the debate stage the other night about what a victim he is. So this is a little unhelpful. But a laptop computer and some memory sticks used to program voting machines in Philadelphia have been reported stolen from a city warehouse. Now, the memory stick is supposed to be specific to a single voting machine, and we're told the laptop didn't have any sensitive data related to elections. But this is ES&S, now the largest voting machine vendor in the country. And as my friend Brad Friedman likes to say, they are 100% unverifiable ways of capturing and tabulating citizens' votes. Well, over in the United States Senate, it appears the Democrats have declined the advice of the outsiders who I cited here on the podcast the other day to use an array of parliamentary procedures and other maneuvers to lock down the Senate and slow down the path to confirmation for Amy Coney Barrett to the United States Supreme Court. The New York Times says Democrats have opted against using parliamentary tactics to grind the Senate to a complete halt, but they are staging a symbolic vote to force Republicans to take a position on protecting the insurability of Americans with pre-existing conditions. And it really annoyed me, both candidates the other night, they talk about just pre-existing conditions and not the insurability of people with them. And I know it's shorthand, but it's really, fuzzy or inaccurate to describe the policy situation that way. So Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, said we're fighting the Supreme Court nomination with the tools that we have. And they're challenging the Republicans to prove that they support protecting the insurability of people with pre-existing conditions. And in a passage where Biden kind of fumbled his language in the debate, he did try to note that there are a lot of people who have survived the coronavirus who now have a pre-existing condition and unknown compromises to their health, like lung scars and other issues that we are starting to identify as the lasting effect of an infection, even if it didn't lead to a serious bout with COVID. The Guardian newspaper from London has acquired some documents from a full-page newspaper ad that was published in South Bend, Indiana, back in 2006. And the Supreme Court candidate, Amy Coney Barrett, signed it. And it supports an organization that has said that life begins at fertilization. I think that's even earlier than conception, isn't it? I don't know how they define those terms in the anti-choice circles. But the statement said, "We, the following citizens of Michiana," that's a regional tag for northwest Indiana, "we oppose abortion on demand. We defend the right to life from fertilization to natural death. Please continue to pray to end abortion." Now, this shows just how extreme her position on abortion is. The group even supports the criminalization of doctors who perform abortions, but not the women who receive them. But they would support the criminalization of discarded frozen embryos. So this is a very, very extreme position. And I hope the Democrats will drive that home during the confirmation hearings. I don't think it's going to change the outcome, but it is important for people to know just how far, far out of the mainstream she is. And who knows? It could produce a third or fourth vote against her nomination from a Republican. But I am not holding any breaths on that. Not at all. So the recovering Kremlin critic, described as the most visible opponent of Vladimir Putin in Russia, Alexei Navalny, he is described as recovered from the attempted poisoning, and at a German hospital, he gave an interview to Germany's Der Spiegel. And he asserted, without offering any evidence, Putin is behind the crime. I have no other versions of the crime. I am not saying this to flatter myself, but on the basis of facts. But then no facts are offered. And I realize that there is a realistic scenario that Putin is responsible for trying to either seriously injure or kill this guy who appears to be a regular irritant to the authoritarian Putin. But we have no skepticism of his assertion here. It is tied to the attempted poisoning of the Skripals in Salisbury, England, a couple of years ago. And that, too, was never proven with public evidence. And we know that Novichok, which is the alleged nerve agent used in both of those incidents, the recipe for Novichok is available on the internets. And so the rush to frame or to, conclude that Putin did it because Navalny says so, well, to me, that is not sufficient. And the spokesman for the Kremlin, Peskov, he said Western security services are working with him. I can be even more specific. Specialists from the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency are working with him these days. Now, this could be a concoction by the Kremlin, but it also could be true. We know that his bank accounts were frozen as a result of a lawsuit from Prigozhin. Prigozhin's the guy who runs the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. He's described as Putin's chef because he runs a big catering operation. And now Reuters is reporting, based on unnamed sources, described as two people familiar with an FBI investigation, that the Russian meddling in the 2020 election involves that same Internet Research Agency, and that they are trying to poison the minds of right-wing American voters with a website that is described as based in Hungary, and it's called the Newsroom for American and European-Based Citizens. And they have basically picked up articles from American websites that promote Trump's efforts to divide Americans, to scare them about voting through the mail. And they, according to this report, they've gotten traction on Gab and Parler. I don't know about Gab, but Parler, or Parler in French, is a social media site used by right-wing Trump supporters. So this is all that we're seeing surface. We've had these warnings again that Russia is trying to run information operations to deceive Americans, to manipulate them. But the polls show that supporters of each candidate have already made up their minds. There are very few persuadable people. I mentioned this from a poll yesterday. 3%, 4%. And the idea that they would use the same tactics and the actual same operation from St. Petersburg 2 elections in a row, I think that's kind of insulting to the spycraft of Russia. Well, at the Old Bailey in London, the extradition hearing for Julian Assange is winding down. Today is expected to be the last day of testimony. And primarily our report today is from yesterday's proceedings, written by Craig Murray. And he says the court that had listened to one prosecutor spend 4 hours cross-examining Kerry Schenkman on individual phrases spent 4 minutes as Noam Chomsky's brilliant exegesis of the political import of this extradition case was rapidly fired into the court record without examination, question, or placing into context of the legal arguments about political extradition. 20 minutes sufficed for the reading of the gist of the astonishing testimony of 2 witnesses that we referred to yesterday, the 2 who worked for UC Global, and followed orders from its boss, David Morales, to install cameras with microphones in the rooms where Julian Assange was holed up at the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Murray notes this evidence went unchallenged and untested. The rich and detailed evidence of Patrick Coburn on Iraq and Andy Worthington on Afghanistan, and you know Andy, he's been a guest on this podcast dozens of times. He is the reporter who has focused on Guantanamo. And Murray says that each Coburn and Worthington were well worthy of a full day of exposition. He said some of the evidence is being edited to remove elements which the U.S. government wished to challenge, and then entered into the court record as uncontested, with just a gist read out in court. The witness then does not appear in person. This reduces the process from one of evidence testing in public view to something very different. Wednesday confirmed the acceptance that this hearing is now devolved into an entirely paper exercise. It is, in fact, no hearing at all. And Judge Beratzer, he says at least twice, has mentioned from the bench that the defense gave her 300 pages of opening argument, and it appears that that's all she's willing to review. So the hearing itself is winding down. Today may be the last day of testimony. And November 4th is when the final arguments will be submitted, and they will not be argued in court. There will be no exchange. There'll be a paper exchange, but no verbal arguments about the elements of the closing arguments from defense and prosecution. So I want to recommend to you, I've linked to Craig Murray's report. He included a copy of Noam Chomsky's statement. I'll read the closing paragraph. In my view, Julian Assange, in courageously upholding political beliefs that most of us profess to share, has performed an enormous service to all the people in the world who treasure the values of freedom and democracy and who therefore demand the right to know what their elected representatives are doing. His actions, in turn, have led him to be pursued in a cruel and intolerable manner. And then he publishes the statement of unnamed witness number 2, who worked for UC Global and offers highly damaging disclosures about the role of the Sands Casino security operation, likely a CIA asset. The Sands, of course, owned by Uber Trump supporter Sheldon Adelson. And all that was reported by Max Blumenthal at the Gray Zone Project back in May. And unfortunately, Consortium News was covering the final session today, and it is having website issues, and only one page of its report appears here at the time of my podcast report. So today is a day when the airlines are unbridled from the money, the bailout money that they took from the CARES Act that originated back in April. And so United and American announced furloughs of 30,000 workers. Disney theme parks are laying off 28,000. Allstate is laying off 3,800. And what's critical is these people will apply for unemployment, but the paltry amounts that states award will not keep them going. And they're going to lose their employer-provided health care. And that, of course, is the biggest deficit of Obamacare, which is coming into full relief now. And I know the Democrats have no choice but to promote upgrading Obamacare because they pissed all over Medicare for All, which would have been a real winner in this campaign and offers such a huge contrast to Trump. Biden did a decent job of pinning Trump down for having no health care plan, even as he works through the courts to eviscerate Obamacare. And will this produce enough pressure for additional bailout money for airlines that squandered their profits and all that money they extracted from us for baggage fees in order to pay executive bonuses and buy back stock? Well, Pelosi and Steve Mnuchin are talking again today. The White House has inched up to $1.6 trillion. The Democrats have scaled it back to $2.2 trillion. The White House deal now has $250 billion for state and local governments. That's some progress. And I hope they can put a package together. But it seems that the prospect is dwindling at this point. Here's today's COVID-19 update. 42,000 new coronavirus cases reported across the United States yesterday, 974 deaths. The states with the most concerning outbreaks are North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Utah, and Montana. And those were areas that were largely spared of a major outbreak during the first 6 months of the pandemic. And I mentioned Wisconsin. Its governor has called on Trump to cancel a pair of mob rallies that are scheduled for this Saturday in the Badger State because it has a 22% surge in positive cases over the past week. Of course, Trump will ignore this. He said at the debate the other night, there have been no adverse effects. Stephen Colbert called out for Herman Cain to speak up, and of course he can't. But to be fair, Herman Cain is the one of the handful of cases we know about. There was a rise in infections in Tulsa after the mob rally on June 20th. But so far, we haven't seen any major hotspots linked to Trump mob rally zones. And so that only emboldens him. But we are seeing an increase of cases across the United States, and in some states, hospitalizations are creeping up, and so is the fatality rate. I want to put it in context. These are not, I'm not aware of any states where they're maxed out in hospitalizations, but there are a handful where it's getting very tight. And our fatality rate has been averaging about 1,000 a day for the past month or so. It does vary from day to day, but when you average it over a week, it's about 1,000. So Andrew Cuomo has identified hotspots in some of the Orthodox Jewish communities in New York State, where the positivity rate rose from 5.5% yesterday to 6.5% today, when the overall rate across the state is 1.27. Italy has registered 2,500 new coronavirus infections over the past 24 hours, the first time the country has exceeded 2,000 cases a day since the end of April. And as it's been pointed out to me, these are cases. There is a slight increase in hospitalizations in Italy. It is more extreme in Spain, where the region of Madrid has tried to resist a national order for more preventive measures. Spain called for new restrictions in certain parts of the country where positivity rates are at 10% or higher, and where patients are occupying 35% of intensive care units. Public health experts report that a new poll shows that only 59% of adults say they plan to receive a flu vaccine this year. It was only 48% last year of American adults who got a flu shot. And I have to say, I'm on the fence. I don't get a flu shot every year. My doctor always advises it. I don't have any particular hang-up about the current cocktail of the flu vaccine, but I just have this generalized wariness. And as the efforts are made to promote a rush development of a vaccine, Trump offering the blue sky that it's going to be ready before the election or, within weeks, he says. Well, one of the companies he has been touting, Moderna, said its COVID-19 vaccine is not expected to be available for widespread use until next spring. Its CEO told the Financial Times November 25th is when we'll have enough safety data to be able to file for an emergency use authorization from the FDA. But, people aren't going to take a vaccine if they don't believe it's safe. And we're seeing that is rippling over into the standard flu vaccine. And if people think that Trump has rushed it in order to try to save his own political fortunes, which is quite apparent, I don't think people are going to take it, and I don't think they're going to get on cruise ships either, as we talked about yesterday. Cornell University has analyzed 38 million articles about the pandemic published in English-language media around the world, and they have identified the single largest driver of misinformation. And his name is Trump. He is the largest driver of the infodemic, falsehoods involving the pandemic. And most of it relates to not the injection of Clorox or his promotion of hydroxychloroquine. I'm still kind of on the fence about that. But the most prevalent topic of misinformation was miracle cures. And That's the kind of blue sky that I was just talking about related to an early arrival of a vaccine. So next Monday, the New Yorker magazine was going to launch its big annual festival online. The headliners were scheduled: Senator Elizabeth Warren, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and AOC and Liz have both withdrawn because the union representing editorial staff members have announced a digital picket line in an effort to force resolution of a labor dispute at the New Yorker. And be prepared. Borat is returning on October 23rd at Amazon. And I have to say, Borat makes me cringe. And his most recent series, I think it was on HBO, I lost interest in after a couple of episodes. But he has this ability to trick famous people into sitting down with him and recording interviews that are deeply embarrassing. The one with Dick Cheney in the last movie stood out for me. Anyway, to promote the new film, Sacha Baron Cohen has been tweeting in character and promoting clips, I guess, from the new movie. In one scene, Borat says Trump is not racist as they show clips of NFL players taking a knee. Black guys love him so much they kneel before him. And the full name of the new film is a mouthful: Borat, subsequent movie film. Delivery of prodigious bribe to American regime for make benefit once glorious nation of Kazakhstan. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it everywhere. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.